Why, hello everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Postcolonial Ponderings. I am Ivania and I will be the host for today's episode. Joining us, we have Abigail, Emmy, Ellie, Max, and Rachel. Leading today's discussion is Max, and he will be introducing us to a very interesting topic. Before we get started, I would like to point you to our introduction podcast in case you missed it, because it will give a lot of information and some context as to some of the stuff we will be discussing. And with that, I'll let Max take the stage.
Why, hello, I'm Max. I'm going to be talking about post-colonial Australia. And I want to start out by saying that my topic was originally simply just the Australian post-colonial worldview. But I have since then realized that Australia as a post-colonial world isn't actually widespread knowledge in like places such as African countries or India, and many don't even see Australia as a post-colonial country, such as America isn't viewed as a post-colonial country. Despite both nations starting with the letter A and being oppressed by Britain early in their days, they're actually very different in the scope of both worldview and culture. And after reading a couple of books in my post-colonial literature class, such as Dirt Music by Tim Winton and My Brilliant Career by Miles Franklin, I've come to a better understanding of how Australia as a culture behaves, although I'm certainly no expert. And to start off, I would like to first talk about the history of how Australia was formed. This will be the TLDR version to save time, but I encourage you to ask any questions you may have. Australia is a country that was colonized by Britain, and it was colonized by British citizens who very much thought of themselves as British. And it's not very well known, at least people around my age, that Australia was actually colonized by the prisoners of Britain. And I don't know what your guys' experience was in high school, but growing up in high school, I never actually had any interaction with Australia. My interaction and knowledge of Australia growing up through middle school, high school, social studies, geography classes was it's on the map right there. And that's where it ended. I've never really learned a whole lot about Australia, so this has been a very enlightening experience for me. And due to the overwhelming population in British jails and the need to acquire people to colonize Australia, a decision was made to send convicts to Australia rather than prison. And so it became a choice of either you go to jail or you go to Australia. And Australia was kind of like a resort version of jail where you're still a prisoner, but like you're not really a prisoner at the time. And so it's a lot more like open-ended and free. And so here we have the land of the rejects. And while there was a priest or two to educate the heathens and to convert the masses, and to convince British people that, yeah, we're totally going on a missionary mission. Yeah, that's what Australia is. There wasn't really missionary work being done for the most part in Australia. There were prisoners, a couple guards, a couple wardens to keep the prisoners in line, if you want to call them wardens. But honestly, many people saw Australia as kind of a second chance, although they'd keep their status of being rejected by the main people of Britain, although they still kept their identity as British citizens. And that feeling of rejection from society is actually one of the reasons the citizens of Australia are so bound together. It's a common past that they can all relate to. And as such, the people of Australia demonstrate a close-knit togetherness that's quite obvious. And this togetherness is displayed quite obviously in the novel My Brilliant Career by Miles Franklin. And one of the highlights of this novel was you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a working class middleman or middle class working man and a high class working man. Like one dude might have a lot of money while the other dude they'll be getting by but not have a whole lot. But you'll see both of them working in the field right next to each other, working practically the same job, or they wouldn't flaunt about their wealth. Like your social status in Australia wasn't based around your wealth. And if people saw you flaunting your wealth in Australia, they'd like cut you down a little bit to make sure that you're equal with everybody else. And that's kind of like how the togetherness is in Australia, is how close-knit everyone is. Like you protect your mates got your back and you have your mates back, that kind of thing. And before I go any further, I would like to clarify that yes, Australia is a post-colonial world. And while Australia is mostly left to govern itself, it's still part of the British Commonwealth, and they haven't officially left the Commonwealth yet. And through different means, the throne can step in to govern Australia, bits and pieces here and there. And the post-colonial status of Australia is quite complex, and many have tried to put a definition on what their status truly is. And David Malouf, who is a well-known and well-renowned Australian author, puts it this way, and this is where I quote, "The paradoxical condition of having our lives simultaneously in two places, two hemispheres that may just be the thing which is most original and most interesting in us. I mean, our uniqueness might just lie here in the tension between environment and culture rather than in what we salvage by insisting either on one or the other." And that is from a book that David Malouf wrote. And that's referencing the togetherness or that feeling of being in between or home, like this feeling of homelessness in Australia. There's a sense that Australians don't have a true home as they've been cast out of Britain and that doesn't feel like home to them anymore. But Australia also doesn't feel like home because that's their prison in a sense. And so that's where you get introduced to this concept of the here and the there. And that comes to mind heavily when referring to Australia. And the basic idea of the here and there is quite simple. And if you want to make a quick definition of it, to a big colony such as, or a big colonizing country such as Britain, the here would be home in Britain, and the there would be whatever country that's being talked about, either to conquer or colonize. Usually a third world country, but it can be a modern society too. Like if Britain wanted to go to war against Germany, Germany would be the there, even though they're not a third world or colonized country, and Britain would still be the here. But Australia is caught in this unique scenario where, as there's no there, as initially it was just another place to send prisoners, they weren't really intending on colonizing it to the degree that it ended up being colonized as. But what happens when the here and there collide? To Australia, they were still very much British citizens underneath the crown. And while a lot of them were prisoners, but there were other people sent to Australia too, not just prisoners, other people who wanted to make a new life in Australia, such as like how many people went to America to make a new life, but just a different place with different expectations. And so after a while, they started to realize they weren't ever going back to Britain. They still thought of Australia as there in a sense. Like if you're on a military mission to go to another country and you think of, oh, I'm going to be home soon, I'm going to be at my hometown, I'm just here temporarily. That's what they were thinking of Australia. But then after time, they started to realize, wait, I'm not going back. This is my new here, but it doesn't feel like here. And so after living in the there for so long, it's only natural that they would start to think of living here partially. But they never really like bridged that gap completely. So it's still stuck between here and there. And earlier, I mentioned that Australia was the land of the rejects. And this theme is tested in the novel Dirt Music by Tim Winton, where the main character, Luther Fox, he not only lives in the land of the rejects, but he's also essentially cast out of the cities he grew up in. And he's sent to the west side of the country. And between a little bit of background knowledge of Australia, between the eastern coastal cities and the western coastal cities is a natural no man's land known as the bush. And the bush is home to many deadly creatures, a fact that is more widely known to the general public. And the jokes of Australia being home to all the dangerous stuff honestly isn't really even a joke. It's where it came from. Is there's that snake that's in the middle of the desert where if you bite it, if you get bitten by it, I'm so tired. If you get bitten by the snake, it basically you have a couple steps until you're just dead instantly. And so like dangerous things like that lives in Australia. And that's not a joke. That's just what Australia is. And so the main cities lie on the safety of the eastern coastline, and that's like where Australia typically is, while the other major cities, like Perth, are on the eastern coast. Because of that giant separation between the two cities, they feel almost like a completely different place. And those cities were founded later and are cut off from the rest of Australia. And so it's almost as if the eastern side of Australia is the rejection zone for Australia. So you end up having this character who goes from being an Australian, a reject, to traveling to the rejection of the rejects. So you have this new place that you're sent to, on the eastern coast, and now this man is just one of the rejects of the rejects. But then, not only that, we learn that he is later cast out of that city. So now he becomes a reject of the rejects of the rejects. And I thought that was really interesting to think about. Think about how many times you'd be cast off before that starts to get to you. Like, I don't know what I would do in that situation. But is Australia a post-colonial nation? Like, yeah, you have this sense of rejection and you have these other feelings that coincide with it. But the answer of whether or not Australia is a post-colonial nation can be summarized pretty simply. And it has been done so in the article Modernity to Makarrata, Australian Through the Post-Colonial Lens by Daniel Cunningham. And in this article, he states, post-colonialism is shaped by white possession, which is always in contestation of indigenous sovereignty and thus positions in Australia as a post-colonial state, which is a lot of big words that basically means because Australia was colonized by white people and oppressed by white people, it was technically a colonized state, and it still hasn't really left that state. And that article was written in 2003, and even though it was 19 years ago, it's still very relevant today. And so, by definition of a post-colonial state, Australia falls under those boundaries. So the question isn't whether or not it's a post-colonial state, but rather why Australia is viewed as a post-colonial nation and America is not. Because America and Britain are quite similar. Both were colonized by the British, both have their own governments on the federal level, and both are not directly ruled by Britain. And while that last one isn't technically completely true for Australia, it might as well be. They kind of just let Australia do their own thing, even though they are still part of the Commonwealth. And it could be argued that the influence of the British Crown is what makes Australia feel more post-colonial than America, even though they are honestly pretty similar. And before, I mentioned the concept of the here and there, and perhaps it's this feeling of Australia being the there that keeps it in our minds as a post-colonial nation. Normally, for us, like how you have in Orientalism by Edward Said, one of the, it's pronounced one of those. By in Orientalism, this concept of the Orient being this place that you go to where it's the East, it's the over there, it's the there. It's usually reserved for third world countries. And so when you think of the there, you're normally thinking of countries that are run down, countries that are third world, countries in poverty. You don't think of places like Australia that have infrastructure in big cities. And when you see cities in Africa that are like, you don't think of like high-rise structures and glass towers as a post-colonial nation. You also don't think of that as Australia or as Africa. And so when you see pictures from African cities where they're actual pictures of African cities that are literal high-rise buildings and literal like downtown Portland style cities, it's like, that's not what you think of when you think of a post-colonial nation. That's not what you think of when you think of Africa. You think of like people living in the bush and people living in tribes still in Africa when that couldn't be further from the truth for the most part. And because Australia is technically still a post-colonial nation in that way, but when we think about the definition of what we think post-colonialism means, the two don't really coincide, which is why so many people don't realize how much of a post-colonial nation Australia really is. But even that, all that to say, it still does exist in such a way. And that's really all I have to say on this matter, unless you want me to go on for another 3 hours. So hopefully I was able to shed some light on the background of Australian post-colonialism. And if you guys have any questions for me, I'll do my best to answer them.
Yeah, I do. So you mentioned that Australia is still a part of the British Commonwealth. And I was wondering if there's ever been any like revolt, I guess, to try and get their independence, or if they do want their independence.
As far as I could tell, I think I read an article. I skimmed through like couple hundred articles just looking for information on Australia, and like half of them had like no relevant information or they were behind paywalls. But I'm pretty sure there was like one, I don't want to call it an uprising, but there was at least one demonstration for their independence. But it wasn't like a huge thing, I don't think. And so like during World War One and Two, Australia was expected to fight alongside of Britain. And I think they gained their independence shortly after that through a signing. And it wasn't nearly as violent as America's independence, which is why Australia is still under the Commonwealth, still technically. So it's definitely more of a we're kind of doing our own thing now, but you still technically kind of have control of us because they didn't leave the Commonwealth, they just govern themselves now. So I don't, as far as I know, there wasn't like a huge like uprising in the sense of like an American revolution.
Do you think, just kind of building off of that, that there is going to be more of a separation, kind of like how, I mean, America, yes, is very like separated. So do you think that like in the future, Australia will kind of just like leave the Commonwealth in general? And I know that's like a total, do you think, random question,
Yeah.
but is there like any information like heading in that direction, or yeah?
Well, I do know that the Queen, because the Queen just passed away recently, and now we have King Charles as the new ruler of Britain, there might be some changes heading to the way of Australia.
Mm-hmm.
But if I remember correctly, they are tightening down on gun laws in Australia. So Australia is becoming a lot more like Britain in the sense of less and less personal weapons being owned by their public. And so I'm pretty sure that there's not going to be any kind of uprising here in the near future. And if there is, there won't be a very effective one.
So wait, so Britain is imposing that gun law on
No.
Australia? Or
No, Australia is doing it themselves. They're just becoming more like Britain.
Okay.
Yeah, so Britain currently, I don't think you're allowed to privately own firearms. And so I'm pretty sure that Australia is moving in a similar direction where you're owning less and less firearms per household. I think maybe you could still own hunting rifles. I haven't done a lot of research into that, so I don't want to say anything. So allegedly, which is going to be my favorite word for the rest of these questions, allegedly, Australia is going to be having less personal weapons owned.
Oh, interesting. Cool.
So something that we've talked about is someplace to go back to.
Mm-hmm.
And so like Dr. Hughes brought up like what would happen if like Oregon, our home, just got like obliterated. What do you think would happen if that happened to like Australia? Do you think Britain would welcome back like all those people that are supposedly a part of the Commonwealth?
Well, I'm pretty sure, I'm going to look this up really quickly so I don't misstep. Is Australia part of NATO? I think Australia is part of NATO. Australia is not a member of NATO. Interesting. It has cooperated with NATO, but it's not a member of NATO. Interesting. Good to know. So I don't know. I would assume that Britain would do something since it's part of the Commonwealth. I'm not sure if, well, one, I'm not sure why anyone would attack Australia in the first place. There's like nothing there of value. So that's the thing, is that Australia, it's one of those countries where they don't have a whole lot of useful, not even like they don't have a lot of useful land. They don't have a lot of tactical resources in their like in their area. Like they have enough for their city and for their people, but as a from a military standpoint, there's no advantage to taking Australia. Like you don't get a closer base to the US or to England by being in Australia. It's like literally like the far corner of the world. Why would anyone go there? And so I don't think Britain would completely ostracize people from Australia if that were to ever happen. But I also don't think that would ever happen. I think Oregon is more likely of being blown up than Australia. And there's nothing in Oregon either.
So I have a question.
Oh, go ahead on.
Oh,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Ron, go ahead.
So that concept of them, like of unhomeliness, of them not really having a home,
Mm-hmm.
did you notice that coming up in any of the Australian literature that we read?
I mainly noticed it in dirt music, just through the through Luther's journey and how he kept moving from place to place, and how just the way that he ended up moving around and not settling anywhere, that kind of felt like unhomeliness. Because normally on a journey like that, the characters, they're going somewhere, like they have an end goal in mind, but there's no end goal for Luther. He's just going. And so there's no the unhomeliness comes from this idea of there's no end in sight. And if there's no end in sight, there's nowhere for you to go back to because you have no stopping point. Because normally if you're going on a trip, you have a destination in mind, so you go there, then you come back. But if there's no destination, there's nowhere to go back to. Does that make sense? Maybe.
Yeah, I can see that. That's cool.
And then Emmy, you had something you wanted to ask?
Yeah, it was a question for you, but also for the rest of our friends here and for any listeners, including Dr. Hughes. I was just, while you were speaking, I was thinking of like the time that has passed since the colonization of Australia and now, and the changes that that's come to make, and really in general, all the colonized countries we've looked at. And I do see Australia, how we were talking about it in class and through the novels we read, as a place, this kind of outcast, how you're saying, like island of rejects.
Mm-hmm.
But I am curious to see if that is still how Australians see themselves, and if other people groups from colonized countries see themselves as like colonized or post-colonized, and like has the time since they've been colonized or colonizers have withdrawn, has the time since that initial event let them produce their own sense of like nationality? I generally, at least from how Dr. Hughes was presenting Australia, they seem like Australians today seem like very prideful and proud to be Australian, not in the sense that they are torn up per se about being sent off, because that was their ancestors, and they seem to have taken what they were given and made something out of it. I'm wondering if all these psychological effects and unhomeliness, if that's still something that Australians feel today, or if that's more in the past.
That's a fantastic question, and that's something that can only really be answered by an Australian. And I won't try to answer that, but that's a great question to be asking, because all of this is from literature from years and years ago. Like all of these ideas of homeliness and togetherness are all, some of them are probably still relevant today. Dr. Hughes would know more, but it's dangerous to think about exact things from, say, 50 years ago and say that's what this people are like, because so much can change in just a generation. And so if we try to say all these things in absolution, it's not a great way to go about it, because even my parents' generation to mine, that's 20 years, is so vastly different from how we do things, how we behave, how we think about ourselves. And so to take a generation from 50 years ago and say, this is what all Australians are like, that's a very bad, dangerous way to think about the world. So that's a fantastic question, Emmy. And I won't even try to answer that because I am not nearly qualified enough. One, I'm not Australian. As much as I might look it, I'm not Australian.
If you're listening to this and you're Australian, do let us know in the comments.
When I send this to my Australian cousins, I actually have like 15 Australian cousins, and I'm not going to send this to them because they are not English majors.
Oh, wow. Well, that was a great conversation that we just had, guys. Very good presentation, Max. Loved hearing it.
Thank you very much. Eli, did you have any question you wanted to ask before we wrap things up?
I got into the conversation a little late, so I didn't quite get the full context of things and wasn't really able to come up with anything, but I enjoyed the conversation. Yeah.
That's fair. We're glad to have you here anyways, Eli. Your
Glad I
presence
made it.
is greatly appreciated. All right, with that, I believe that will wrap things up for this episode. Ivania, if you would like to do our outro for us. I think Ivania's audio might have glitched out in the last couple of minutes, so I will do the outro for her. That's all for the questions and everything. I think that does it for this episode. Thank you so very much, me, for this wonderful explanation of research that I did on topic of episode. And to thank you to all of our wonderful listeners for tuning into today's podcast. If what we talked about today has at all piqued your interest, please be sure to check out our other podcasts. And like always, have a great rest of your day. Bye.
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 Bye.